Okay, so do you know sometimes you're in a situation and you hear a certain piece of news and it really impacts you in a very strong way? Happens a lot, right? And then you'll go tell someone that you're really like close to or connected to, and you tell them the story, and their response is like, "Okay, so," and you're thinking, "What do you mean? Okay, so why isn't it significant to you the same way it's significant to me?" Today we're going to talk a lot about empathy. What is empathy? How does it enhance our relationships? And what happens with those individuals that seem to have lower levels of empathy? Does that mean that they're selfish? Does that mean that they're just cold-hearted? Is there something else at play? And is there anything out there that they can do to increase their empathy, level of empathy? Remember, we all love it when people feel like they connect with us and they understand us and they show us real empathy. It's the people that don't that sometimes we really struggle with. So today we're going to talk about empathy, its properties, and the different levels of intensity of empathy and where that comes from. My name is Daniel Ifra, LCSW, here on the SaneStorming Show, where we sanestorm, not brainstorm, sanestorm ways to keep each other sane in a complex world. So we're going to talk today about low empathy. Low empathy is but before talking about low empathy, we need to first establish what is empathy. Of course, there's different levels of empathy, right? There's a higher level of empathy. There's a lower sense of empathy. But what is empathy? Empathy is basically the ability to feel for another person's experience, for another person's emotional experience. So if someone is feeling extremely happy, lucky, excited, and I can tap into that on an emotional level and feel somewhat of that experience, maybe not directly, but by virtue of the fact that they're experiencing it, I'm able to tap into that on an emotional level, then that's called empathy. Sympathy, on the other hand, sympathy is more or less expressing or showing is the expression of the feeling of empathy. So if I sympathize with somebody, I'm basically expressing to them how I realize that must be so hard, blah, 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 blah. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm really feeling that experience or I'm tapping into the experience. I'm basically just sympathizing with them and saying to them, oh, that must be so hard. So I'm actually expressing what needs to be expressed as a person that may be empathic, but it has really no bearing on the fact that I'm really experiencing that. But empathy, on the other hand, is really the heart of it all. Empathy is where you have the person actually feeling for somebody else and actually experiencing on some level what they may be going through, or at least being able to connect to the emotion that they're experiencing as a result. So if a very close friend of yours is getting married and you're at that wedding, chances are, if you have a healthy level of empathy, you're going to really be able to be truly and sincerely tap into his happiness on some level. It's not like you're getting married, but that little element, if you could take a little piece of that, that's sort of what's going on for you on a very minuscule kind of way. So today we're talking about low empathy. Now, when we talk about low empathy, we're primarily referring to the connotation usually is people that sort of like sees things around them and could hear of a piece of very sad news or something like that and have low empathy, meaning it just doesn't hit them so hard. It's like, oh, okay, fine. So I heard that 50 million people died. All right, well, sure. Okay, next. Now, low empathy doesn't have to be that way. It can be on so many different levels, right? How bad do I feel for, or how much does it hit me when the person right across from me suffered a terrible loss, and I know that person well. So what level does it impact me on emotional, in terms of in the emotional realm? So that's the idea of low. So low empathy. Here's the thing. It's like this. The idea that the issue that people have with low empathy is stereotyping low empathy is a result of what we call a person being more narcissistic. Narcissistic basically means selfish. Not in the clinical term. Clinical terms have a whole bunch of different criteria, but when we talk about narcissism or self-centered, selfish, that's what we're referring to. So people that are selfish or self-centered usually do not have a high level of empathy. And it's unfortunate. And those are the people that, you tend to be more what we call cold-hearted. And they just don't care so much for other people. So that's one type of low empathy. We're not going to be talking so much about that low empathy today. We're talking about a person who can be really good, really sincere, yet struggle with being able to empathize with others, which is what we call low empathy. And by the way, we all should be able to connect. We should all be able to empathize with the low empathizer. Because if you think about it, none of us on any level really experience what the other person's experienced to the max. We feel bad for somebody. We can really, our heart goes out to them and we can feel that. But how often can we say that the same impact that person's experiencing and feeling on an emotional level, that we actually carry that same level? That's very few and far between. So, and we can debate if that's even healthy, if that's practical, if that's sustainable, right? If somebody goes around feeling the full level of pain of 5 different people that they encountered that day, we can wonder, is this guy going to make it through the day without having to be put away, going to get on meds? So we can understand the concept of low empathy. We all have our empathy, the threshold for normal empathy is by default not it's only a minuscule or a microcosm of what the other person's experiencing. But when we talk about low empathy, we're talking about even on that level, on the level that we consider to be appropriate empathy in our social circles. Lower empathy would be the person that really doesn't have that same regard. He can have somebody that he knows or somebody who's going through a heart-wrenching situation and it just doesn't impact him. Maybe he'll think about it on a logical, on a more theoretical level, but it's not going to really impact him much. And the concern with that is obviously that if you have somebody who's not really feeling for others, so of course that and then it appears to at least mimic being very selfish and self-centered. But even more than that is if a person doesn't really understand other people and can't relate to other people, they're going to have a very hard time responding and interacting appropriately with other people. So I'll give you just a small example. If, for example, if I have a very low empathy and my child comes home and tells me that somebody picked on him in school and he was crying. So when I have a lower level of empathy, I might answer and respond, well, toughen up, man, right? But if I have an appropriate amount of empathy, I might think to myself, wow, if I was that age and that happened to me, that would be so hurtful. And then I would say, toughen up. No. And then I would just sort of either try to brainstorm or problem solve. And maybe part of it is for that child to toughen up. That could very well be. But it's going to be a very different response. So the question is, where does this low empathy come from? Does it come from someplace? Some people have it more than others. What if we were to peel away the layers, what would we find? And there's a few different things that we have to keep in mind when we talk about empathy. Okay. One of them is abstract thinking, the ability to think in the abstract. People, there are different kinds of things. We have other podcasts that I'm sure have touched upon this in the past, but there is the abstract thinker versus the concrete thinker. The concrete thinker is somebody who thinks in absolute, very clear terms, not great at visualizing things unless they actually see them. Fantasy per se is not their thing. Abstract thinker has an easier time with imagination, has an easier time with thinking about what would be if. So if you think about it, to have empathy can take a certain element of abstract thinking. If a person's a good abstract thinker and they hear of a terrible tragedy that befell somebody, and the first thing that comes to their mind is, oh my gosh, could you imagine what that's like, right? Could you imagine what's that like? Those are the famous words. Could you imagine what that's like? Somebody that has lower level of abstract thinking and more of a concrete thinker is going to struggle with empathy, because when the question becomes, can you imagine what that person's going through? The answer pretty much is no. So that's one piece of abstract thinking. That's one piece of empathy that's important. Another part of empathy that's very important is perspective taking. Being able to see the perspective of others. What I mean by that is that some people can readily or more easier understand that there's different ways of looking at a situation, and as a result of that can understand, okay, I personally look at it like this, but I see how somebody else might view that situation as being different. For example, somebody thinking about the fellow next to me that has a mediocre job and as a result of that struggles to pay their bills. So personally, I see that simply because that person has not applied himself as much. So my perspective is that person has not really applied himself as much, and therefore he's not being as successful as he could be. And that's where it starts and where it ends. The other thing, though, being able to see the perspective of the others is thinking a little bit more of, well, why isn't that person stepping up to the plate? What's he going through? There must be reasons, or there must be circumstances that caused him to evolve to such a level of function in terms of being able to take the bull by the horns and move forward. Maybe it's because of his anxiety or confidence level or the resources or support. There's all different, right? What's his perspective on the matter of why things happen there? And then once I'm willing to embrace other people's perspectives, I could probably justify it and even come to peace with it and sort of like, hey, that makes sense to me more. But if I'm not good at seeing the perspective of others and everything's about my perspective, it's going to be much harder to empathize. Because if I say, oh, there was, for example, kid got his license. How about this one? Kid got his license yesterday and today he got into a major fender bender, right? So there's two ways. One is, okay, well, that kid needs to go back to school. He shouldn't be driving in the first place. He doesn't know how to drive. Too bad on him, right? But if you're somebody that thinks about the other person's perspective, listen, he's not experienced. You started off not being so experienced as well. And here he is. He was in a situation, for whatever the reason was, he had that fender bender. So yeah, now he's gonna pay the price. So that's tough. So perspective thinking is a very, very big component of any empathy. That's number two. The third one that empathy requires is really being able to emotionally personalize a lot of these. These are feelings. You can there is a level of empathy that is more of an intellectual level of empathy, but a lot of empathy is more emotionally based. If a person is weaker in his ability to sense and to feel things emotionally, then he's going to have a harder time with empathy. So you have these let's say three different components that, if one of them is lacking, it's going to take a toll on the empathy. If all three of them are lacking, it's going to take even a greater toll on empathy. So does that mean that this person is a bad person? Does it mean he's a selfish person? Does it mean he's narcissistic? Absolutely not. It just means that there are traits there that make it very, very difficult for him or her to be able to empathize well. And unfortunately, that results in some very harsh kind of interactions and people feeling that they don't really care, they don't really get it, they're not really with them on an emotional level, they don't really understand me. And the truth is, they probably don't to some level. So that is empathy. That is the lack, some things of what empathy requires and why people might have a lack of empathy. In a nutshell, if you think about all these things in three things and you kind of sort of put it together, one of the big reasons why people don't empathize with others is because they objectify them. They objectify the issue. Okay, so let's just say, for example, there was a fly and we needed to kill the fly. So we took a fly swatter and we killed the fly. Why don't we feel empathy for the fly? Or why do some people feel less empathy for the fly? The reason is because we don't look at the fly as a real thing. We look at the fly as basically an object. And the more you objectify something, the further it becomes from being humanistic and personalized. When it's further from being humanistic and personalized, there's less perspective taking, there's less emotional stuff going on, and it's obviously more abstract because it's just an inanimate object. So really, empathy, lack of empathy, low empathy is usually because to some level we objectify the situation and we don't bring it home. So here we are. What is there to be done about that? Is there anything to be done about that? And the answer is yes. There are ways of building up empathy in a gradual way. This is something that we do here all the time here in Aspire. There's no easy formula. But what we need to remember is it's going to require all the things that we're lacking. We need to get those back into whack. We need to work on the perspective taking. We need to work on being more abstract. And number 3 is less and bringing it home. And overall is actually objectifying things less. How do we objectify things less? Well, if every time I killed a fly, I was somehow able to think about, wow, could you imagine if something like that happened to so-and-so? Then it would be a different story because you wouldn't be objectifying the fly anymore, right? If you heard a bad piece of news that happened to someone, and it's sort of like just rolled off your shoulders, but then you stop and thought for a second, hey, what if that very thing actually happened to me? Wow, it's a different experience. It's no longer objectified. That would be the beginning of the journey of getting yourself to a more empathic place that will no doubt enrich your relationships and the connection between you and the people you care about. To kind of hit this home, I want to tell you over a story that I heard that I really think characterizes a lot of this empathy and what it's all about. To drive this home, I'd like to say over a story that I once heard about a great rabbi. And this rabbi lived many years ago he was in the city of Yerushalayim. His name was Rav Chatzkel Abramsky. And the story goes as follows. He was walking to the Beis Medrash like he did every day to learn Torah and to do what it is that he did. And on his way, he encountered a little girl about the age of 5, and she was sobbing. And he stopped and he said, "Little girl, what's the matter? Why are you crying?" And she said, "Because I lost my my toy boat. I had a toy boat and it got lost." So he quickly went into action. He took the girl. He went to the nearest toy store. He stopped everything. All his students stayed back. He went there, nearest toy store. He went and he asked her which kind of boat it was, what did it look like, and he bought her this little toy boat, and she was the happiest girl in the world. And he sent her on her way, and then he continued. And obviously, they had a lot of students with a lot of question marks, like, okay, like, is this really the most important thing that we needed to take care of this morning? Like, taking her to a toy store and whatnot. And they said, why would you do something like that? And the rabbi answered back so profoundly. He said, could you imagine for a moment if you had a cargo ship that was coming from overseas, and it was everything that you ever had was on that ship, and you just got word that it sunk? How would you feel? So they're like, yeah, but this was a toy. And he said, yeah, but to her, in her world, that toy boat was like a real boat to us. You see? So therefore, it doesn't matter the validity of if the boat was really how much the boat was worth, if the boat really had value or didn't have value. That's not what matters. What matters is her experience. The experience that this girl was experiencing to her toy boat is pretty much akin to the experience we would feel if there was a real boat. So that has to be dealt with, because we're here to understand people and to be able to reconcile things that people go through based on their experience, not our experience, their experience. So if to them this was something very, very meaningful, that's all that matters. There's no difference. And I thought that was chapters and chapters of a book in of itself, because basically what he's teaching us is we need to understand that the bottom line of whether something has merit or not sometimes matters, but when it comes to empathy, that's not what matters, because we're not here to debate whether or not it was something that was worth what we think it should be worth. What we're here to understand is the person's experience that we are observing and that we're trying to connect with, and that is individualized, and that has no bearing on whether or not it's a legitimate kind of tragedy or not. So if we want to understand and we want to be able to empathize better, we need to do a lot less judgment about the validity of what it is that they're worrying about, and really tap into the experience that they're experiencing that they're worried about. So what I want you guys to do for this week is something along the following. I want you to, these things happen all the time. We hear something, we see something, and we just don't think anything of it. You see a homeless guy in the street. Let's just try that. See a homeless guy in the street. We don't think more than a second, if we do think at all, right? But what happens if next time we would stop and say, you know what? Just think about the fact that if I didn't have a home, what would it be like for me? So imagine this experience of this guy. Maybe he did it to himself. Maybe he's on drugs. Maybe all that. Maybe this, maybe that. But it doesn't necessarily have to matter that much. I can still empathize with the experience. So next time, right? Next time you come home and you're tired and exhausted, and your little kid your daughter is there and she's crying, and you're like, what's the matter? And you're like, because I lost my lolly, right? So I'm not saying you need to turn the world over, and I'm not saying you have to go buy her a lolly and all that. But what I am saying is to stop for a moment right before you dismiss it and say to yourself, if I would have lost something very meaningful to me that was my comfort, that kept me in my comfort level, right? And I had that and I was excited about it and then I lost it, what would it have done for me? Okay, so can I connect with that experience and stop judging her on the superficial aspect of what it really is in actuality? Something to think about. Let me know your thoughts, and if you were able to actually connect to this on any kind of level, and if you were able to bring it into something that happened in your life that you would have probably just waved away, and instead you just took an extra second to think about it, and that in itself can make a huge difference. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you very soon on the next episode of the SaneStorming Show.